constituents of the Freedom Zone. The first time we've ever done this, so it should be a very exciting couple of days if you can stay around. And we're kicking off this morning with a discussion about a new book with Dan on my right and Douglas on my left, discussing the European Union. I'm also director of the Better Off Out campaign, which is run by the Freedom Association, so you can tell the general direction in which this discussion this morning will go. Now, the former German president has been kind enough to tell us that 84% of all our laws now come from Brussels. So it took a German to tell us, and that indeed shows us something of what the European Union is all about. And all of that over decades has, of course, eroded our institutions, and that is what Douglas and Dan have been writing about and have come up with some answers, I hope. On my left is Douglas Carswell, who is a member of the mother of all parliaments, the British Parliament, with a number of constituents. I think you said 84,000, going down to 60,000. On my right is Dan Hannan, member of the European Parliament for the southeast of England, who has a very large number of constituents. In fact, so large we probably don't know how many, but I think millions. And that probably tells us all we need to know. So I'm going to hand over to Douglas first for about 15 minutes. Dan second for about 15 minutes, and then we'll throw it open for some blue sky thinking.
Thank you very much. I may move to the side so the light's not shining in my eye. And the very first time I was conscious of what became the European Union, the EEC, I remember being told that it was basically a good thing. I distinctively remember a conversation with my parents when I was a boy of probably about 8 or 9 or 10, where they said that this thing, the EECC or the EEC, I think people weren't quite sure what it was a good thing. And I remember it being explained to me as being a good thing because it meant that we could trade more cheaply and freely with European countries, and that it was going to be good for our economy. And I think that there are a great many people in Britain, particularly of my parents' age, who approved EU membership, who believed that it was indeed going to be good for the economy. They didn't really understand that it was going to be about much else other than the economy. They thought of it as an economic community. They thought of it as being about free trade. They thought of it as being a sensible thing for Britain to do. Much of the justification for us being members of the EEC was indeed framed in economic terms. I think, though, if we look back over the past 20 or 30 years, we see that a great deal has now changed, and that a lot of the original rationale and justification for our EU membership is no longer there. The sort of European Union on offer has changed. When we signed up to being members of the European Economic Community, we believed that we were joining what was in effect a free trade area. We believed that it was simply about reducing barriers to trade, about allowing us as a trading nation to do better. We believed, I think, that given the experience of our economy in the 60s and the 70s, that somehow being more closely tied economically to the slightly more prosperous economies of Europe, we would somehow do better. Some of the pressures and the competition would allow us to do better. Clearly, though, that has changed. That is not the European Union that is on offer. What is on offer is membership of a centralized, unified EU state. The economic rationale for being part of a free trade area has disappeared. Europe is no longer about free trade. It is about corporatism. It is about managed and bureaucratically controlled trade and economic transaction. Many of the free trade rationale for being part of it simply no longer exists. And many businessmen who do business throughout Europe increasingly find that they are not producing what customers in other European countries want, but what director generals in the Brussels machinery prescribe. Another thing that has changed since we joined is the success of our own country. I think we've shown over the past 20, 30 years, present economic circumstances notwithstanding, that actually we are a very economically capable people. We are able to reverse what seemed like inevitable economic decline. That 100-year period where cities like Birmingham went from being economic centres of the world to the 1950s and the 60s and the 70s when it looked like we were economically doomed, we showed that actually we could reverse that with the right sort of government and the right sort of approach to low taxes and the removal of restrictions on trade. We could actually hold our own in the world. I think the lack of confidence that we had in the 1970s has to a large extent dissipated. Another thing that's changed since we joined the EU is the performance of Europe's economy. If you looked at the world in 1960 or 1970, the countries of Italy, Belgium, Germany, France looked like they were incredibly successful. The rest of the world didn't appear anything like as successful. With perhaps the exception of America and Japan, Europe looked like it was an economic winner. That's simply no longer the case. Europe since 1992, and I choose the date 1992 because that is when the so-called single market came into existence. We're still waiting for it there. Since 1992, Europe's economy has performed incredibly sluggishly. Now, I think I'm right in saying that most other parts of the world, be it South America, the Far East, India, certainly China, most parts of the world have actually done better relatively since 1992 than Europe. It is Europe that is the slow, sluggish economic part of the world. It is Europe with its high tax, high regulation, dirigiste economic model that is failing. I imagine that over the next 20, 30 years, it is more likely to be India and China that create wealth than Belgium or Italy. A fourth thing that has changed, I think, is our understanding of what makes a society successful. I think over the past 20 or 30 years, particularly with the advent of the internet over the past decade, there's a recognition that small, in economic terms, is beautiful. In the 1950s and the 60s, it seemed like the economic powerhouses were the big countries. Soviet Russia was able to produce a great many tractors, or at least they were able to pretend that they were producing a great many tractors. Increasingly, though, I think we've come to recognize that the new economy depends on small units, on tailored production, not on mass production. It is the small parts of small countries on this planet, the Singapores, the Switzerlands, the smaller economic units, which tend to do better than the big ones. And even the biggest units of all, India and China, are doing well because they are allowing at a provincial level, local provincial autonomy over economic decision making. The idea that you need to be part of some gargantuan trade